Hello everyone and welcome to this post on Viking archaeology, which will take us to the Viking Age town of Wolin in Poland. And for those of you who are not familiar with Wolin, it is a large settlement at the mouth of the river Oder, one of the great rivers of lowland northern Europe. And it's known to many with an interest in Viking archaeology, in part because of the great finds from many years of excavations in what was certainly a big trading node of the Baltic Sea, but also because of a long-standing discussion as to whether this place can be identified with the places Jumna or Vineta mentioned by early medieval writers, or even with the fabled Jomsborg fortress of saga fame. The reason why I'm going to Wolin for this post is not the Jomsborg story, but rather this amazing book. It's a two-volume book that came out in 2019 actually. I must have been occupied with something else because I didn't notice it immediately, but it was brought to attention by one of the subscribers to this series, so thank you very much for that. And I was extremely happy to see this book coming out, summarizing the great excavation and research on Wolin, and in beautiful English. When I first wanted to study Wolin about 20 years ago, seeking up information about this place involved going to the library and plowing through dozens of old journals written in Polish. I remember using my dictionary intensively. Then later I got in touch with curator Błażej Stanisławski, who was then at the site and who also wrote some seminal books and papers on Wolin. At one point I spent about a week in the archives researching the materials. Now, the book that we are mainly concerned with today, this one, is the result of a great research project that's been undertaken at the Polish Academy of Science and the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnology, and led by Dr. Marian Rębkowski, who's an esteemed medieval archaeologist who's published for decades on other medieval towns in Poland. And it really is a treasure of information on everything you might want to know, both about Wolin, but also in general about Viking Age towns and their material culture. So the bigger of the two volumes here, volume 2, is concerned with the artifact finds and their specialist studies on everything from pottery to amber finds and leather shoes and glass beads, whatever your interests are. So some of the objects found tells us about the trade and exchange that took place in Wolin, like the weights and scales seen here. And there are also objects that were brought probably by travelers, like the Scandinavian type head you also see here in this picture. There's also a lot of evidence for craft to be found here. Glass bead making is one such thing. There are combs of different styles, Scandinavian styles, other styles that are definitely not Scandinavian, from craft workshops where refuse from bone working was also found. And then there's lots of amber finds, for which Wolin is particularly famous. Of course, it's in the part of the Baltic Sea where amber occurs prolifically, and it was worked to a great extent in Wolin. There's also the wooden finds that are spectacularly well preserved here. They include Scandinavian style objects like this handle you see here, but also things that are culturally Slavic, like this quite well-known Sviatowit figure, the god with the four heads. And then I think this is my personal favorite, this trumpet mouthpiece. I'd love to hear what it would sound like with a Viking Age, probably birch bark trumpet. The site of Wolin consists of a number of different landscape elements, and those are the ones that are examined in this book here. There's one settlement called the Silver Hill area, which is not concerned so much here. in this book, there is burials and settlements over a whole kilometer or more along the riverside. And there's been excavations in many of these places. I think the most recent big excavations took place in the late 1990s and 2002. They were actually in progress when I visited the site the first time in 2002. But most of the excavations have taken place in what is called the Old Town, the place where the medieval settlement grew in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. And some of these excavations go all the way back to before the First World War or Second World War, where the archaeologist Carl August Wilde excavated here in 1934 to 1941. Then came the war, and after the war, the Polish archaeologist Władysław Filipowiak led research here from 1952 and practically all the way to his death in 2014, with a number of collaborators, of course. The present book mainly deals with the very important excavations that took place in the 1970s and 80s in what is known as Trench 6 and Trench 8. And this is where we had some of the best evidence for the settlement in Wolin and some of the longest stratigraphy. In some points there are more than 5 meters of accumulated layers of settlement in these trenches. And it's also importantly where we find some of the earliest activity, perhaps the earliest activity in the site. And that's what this current book is concerned with. The problem with research on Wolin is that it's tied in with a lot of, if you will, mythology about the site. So there's the story about the Vinita or Jumne site, which early medieval writers, including Adam of Bremen, talks about. And I think it's quite plausible. Most people accept that this is the site that Wolin is identical to. It's not absolutely proven, but it's a good guess. So before the Second World War, this area where Wolin is located was part of Germany and excavated by German archaeologists. And of course, they saw this fabled place as part of their heritage, which they identified with. And then after the war, when the Wolin area became part of Poland, after the settlements after the Second World War, the Polish archaeologists who now became curators of the area saw it from a different perspective. This area had been part of a Slavic settlement area in the early Middle Ages, and they saw Wolin as sort of a rediscovered Slavic heritage of this area, which had been conquered from pre-World War II Germany. And in the years after the Second World War, if you read what's written, especially by Władysław Filipowiak, you can see this insistent drive to show that Wolin is a counterpart of Hedeby, the Viking Age trading place in Germany in particular. So everything that Hedeby has, Władysław Filipowiak tries to find in Wolin as well, and that goes for the size of the settlement and its organization, and importantly also for its date. So if Hedeby goes back to the 8th century, so must Wolin. And I think he was trying to show that this place, which was in an area dominated by Slavs, lived up to or excelled the German settlement area. It was not sort of a scientific discourse. I think it was just sort of a feeling of the heritage. Now, the problem with this is that it was not really something that you could discuss in Polish archaeology. There was a great respect for Filipowiak and for any professors, really. And when I visited Wolin first in the early 2000s, I could sense that there was a lot of questions really that were not being asked, even if researchers were aware of them. And I remember I took the opportunity because I thought at that time I was a graduate student. So I thought I could be the crazy guy who comes and brings something into the open. So I went to a students' conference in Poland and presented a paper that asked whether Wolin had been like Hedeby or had been like a completely different sort of place. And I still remember how the reactions were quite shocked to the paper. Now, the results that are synthesized here by Professor Rębkowski are really interesting and also somewhat different from what we thought we knew about Wolin before. One of the great results, I think, of all this work is that they can put a new chronology to the development of Wolin. Now, I know chronology sounds really boring, but to somebody like me, it's really the anchor point of everything that we can say about the Viking Age archaeology. So if you change something by a half or a whole century, that's really massive. That means that something that you used to think belonged together in the same historic period may belong in a completely different history. And that's what happens here. So in the earlier studies, the first activity in Wolin was set to come about in the 7th century, so in the 600s. And that was based on perfectly sensible readings of radiocarbon dates and stratigraphy and artifacts. But something that's perfectly sensible is not always right. And what the archaeologists are able to show in this book is that some of those early dates were wrong, quite simply in this way. But anyway, the end story to that is that whereas we used to think that Wolin started out in some way, even back in the 600s, that's wrong. They can now show that the first activity of the site is quite a bit later, in the late 8th century, so in the late 700s, or even in the early 900s. So it's more or less coinciding with the Viking Age. And more importantly, it's also coinciding with what a lot of other data shows to be the period when Slavs first settled in this coastal area. So many things come together in a more understandable way in this study. They can also confirm something that was actually the point of the discussion paper I made 20 years ago. So, of course, I was very happy to see that. They can confirm that the early settlement is really not a trading settlement the way that it was previously presented in some publications. It's a Slavic village which is placed here on a great spot in the landscape and has some contact with the outer world, but not very much. A change only really comes about in the second half of the 9th century, so after 850, when quite rapidly this settlement develops into something completely different. Now that's actually a little earlier than it seemed when I tried to study this many years ago. At that time we would have said around 900, or that was what I said anyway. But now they can put that probably sometime not too far after 850. And at this time something completely different comes about on this spot. A planned settlement, a very dense settlement with streets that are paved with wooden floors and houses that are set very densely. Exactly the way we would expect to find it in a place like Hedeby or Birka. But as Rębkowski notes, this is very different from what we would find or expect to find in a typical Polish Slavic fortress, which is the other thing that Wolin has been discussed as. So what we see here is clearly a Baltic Sea emporia, a Viking Age town, the way we'd find it in the Baltic Sea area, but different from what we'd see in most of the Slavic area. This place thrives in the 10th century, in the 900s, and into, well, all through actually the 11th century. and only comes to an end at the end of the 11th century. From that time onward, there's a period when Wolin is quite a different place again, where it seems like more or less a village-style settlement that's attached to a fortress. And that lasts all the way up to the late 13th century, to somewhere around 1270, when it re-emerges as a town now, what's called a chartered town. So the typical medieval town in the Baltic Sea area. Now with timber frame buildings and brick buildings and all that. The Viking Age town, which of course is most relevant for us in this series, so begins in the 800s and flourishes for about 200 years. It's got crafts, workshops with combs and amber and metal manufacturing. And it's got evidence for a very mixed settlement, just like you'd find in other Viking Age towns. It's not, however, if you read closely in the archaeology here, it's not something like a Slavic settlement. This is not what you would expect for the fabled Viking fortress of Wolin. It's not a place which is like a Scandinavian colony. Most of the material culture you find in Wolin is actually quite typical of the area. The pottery, for instance, is typical Pomeranian pottery. There's lots of individual finds, as you would expect in a place where lots of visitors came to and people from coming from other areas lived in. But it's primarily, it is what you would expect of a big trading town of this region. And that's where I think, as far as we can judge the archaeology today, Wolin finds its place as a Pomeranian trading town in the Baltic Sea area. Now, that was all for this post. I was glad that you followed me all the way, and I hope that you will be returning for more posts on Viking Age archaeology.